In relation to the misclassification of workers, we can just revert back to that for a moment. You mentioned a few times that revenue don't collect tax and you don't decide employment status, and that's fair enough. The Department of Social Protection.
Definitely, we do collect tax.
Yeah, sorry, that you collect tax, but that you don't decide in employment status. So just in relation to that, in relation to the classification and employment status, in the case of the courier sector, revenue did be, were involved in that because the inserted, the revenue put forward 4 issues to which would identify and, if you like, would separate out self-employment around owning a vehicle that the driver paid for outgoings on the vehicle, that were doing piecework, and that they had a self-employment contract. But those 4 factors, you recall that the Denny case, the Denny Supreme Court case, that was, that case showed that is out of line with the, with the way it should be, and it's also out of line with this year's code of practice. Would that not be correct?
Deputy, the features of self-employment and employment and contract of and contract for, there are a number of features. None of them on their own are determine the facts. And what I said earlier is that we're not the primary agency for determining an individual social insurance class. So what we were dealing with at the time, and the idea that we would try and compare the 2021 Code of Practice with what officials were doing in 1997 is kind of, maybe it's hard to see the relevance.
The point is, though, Mr. Cody, is that revenue specifically wanted those 4 items inserted back in 1997. That's the point I'm making. Could I just ask you, is that the reason why the deal was discontinued in 2019?
No, the issue around POA modernisation, I suppose what has happened since is that the environment has changed fundamentally, as we talked earlier about the growth of the platforms, the growth of whatever gig economy, and also some of the work we've done, I think that we had issues in relation to takeaway food, delivery food. We have the Cashan Midlands Limited case, in which we looked at the idea of the employment status of delivery, takeaway food delivery, and in that case we were satisfied that the contractual arrangement was one of contract of services, and we took that to appeal, and we have been successful in the High Court. So there's an impression that revenue are sitting on their hands in relation to this area. Every year we engage with our colleagues in social protection and the WRC on looking at classification and bogus self-employment, where we have evidence to support an approach. We do that.
I think that's fair enough, but I think that this particular sector, you mentioned earlier on about, workers at the lowest end, that, the members of the PSE, you'll understand, would be concerned about this because, you're talking about probably some of the most vulnerable workers in the state. But could I just ask you, just in relation to the discontinuing of it, is it a case that it was discontinued because it's actually unlawful? It could be termed to be unlawful under Irish law, in the sense that, that it's taken a whole section, a whole group of workers as being self-employed, and that under Irish law that you couldn't actually take a group of workers, as was confirmed by the in the Denny case, but also confirmed by the state solicitor in 2009, Mr. Mark Connaughton, and he said, and I quote, that there's no legislative provision for appeals officers to make decisions on groups or classes of workers, unquote. Was that a factor in you discontinuing this work on this deal with the courier sectors?
The reason that the scheme was being discontinued was because of the introduction of POA modernisation.
So this didn't have an impact in it at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And could I just ask you in relation to the withholding tax on the expenses of the couriers? Some of your documentation refers to the withholding tax several times, but revenues. The deal at that time included a flat rate expenses allowance for couriers, and that was a system that's exclusive for, as I understand it, for employees, that's actually itemised on your own revenues website. That a flat rate expenses allows a worker to claim back costs, but nowhere in the 1997 tax deal with the courier sector and representatives of that sector is a withholding tax mentioned. Revenue, that system is there to deal with people who are PAYE workers. Is that correct?
And as set out at the time, the arrangement was that we were going to provide the opportunity for courier companies to opt voluntarily to apply the POA system in respect of self-assessed couriers that they engaged with. And it was a methodology to try and bring the sector within tax compliance. So it was...
I understand that, and I think people would appreciate that at the time, that it's a bit of a Wild West situation in that, there was a lot of people not registered for tax, a lot of people not on the books, people being paid for cash and all of that. And I think people would appreciate that. But I think that the problem with the deal is the fact that, that it made all couriers, de facto made all couriers self-employed. And that, that if an employee wanted to try and change that, which is very difficult because obviously the power relationship, as you've acknowledged yourself, is very, very limited in terms of the amount of cards that the employee has to deal. They need to take an individual case to scope in the Department of Social Protection and then possibly to the High Court. So, it made it impossible. The point here is that one of the reasons we're very concerned about is it made it impossible for an employee to actually change it. There's no cycle courier or motorcycle courier that would be in a position to actually jump through all those hoops too easily, would there? Would you agree with that?
I think it's actually interesting when we deal with people in relation to contract of and contract for. You'd be surprised about how many of the people. Generally, what we have is that we have some employees, and I use the term employees who want to be self-employed, and we have some who want to be employed. And the challenge we have is to deal with the contractual arrangement, and essentially the flat rate scheme as part of the withholding system that was used in 1997 was to give effect to the fact that the self-assessed taxpayer would have expenses in the normal course, and this was a simplified system to try and make sure that they were in the tax system. It was also in the background in which the determination had been in that sector that these were self-employed from a social protection point of view. So that was the environment. And like I've been looking at a lot of the papers. I was looking at the papers going back into the 80s on this. This was, like kind of, as you say, a challenging sector at the time. The system has moved on. The motorcycle couriers and cycle couriers, I think the impact of secure email, it's not as a kind of a all-pervasive. Van couriers now, in the context of e-commerce, is the growing thing. I was looking at stats yesterday in the context of using the NACE code that couriers are in, and the ratio is about 3-to-1 employee compared to self-employed.
Okay, but could I just ask you this? Do you accept that there's a legal question here around how legally correct this was, given the advice from the Chief State Solicitor, Mr. Mark Connaughton, back at that time, back in 2009, and also the Delhi case, the fact that a whole group of workers, a whole category of workers were taken as being self-employed. Do you accept that that may be legally questionable what happened there at this point?
I don't accept that was the that was what we did. What we did is where the couriers were self-employed. The withholding system applied to that.
Mr. Cody,
we did not determine that they were self-employed. Do
we accept that it may have been legally questionable? I can't comment on that. And just finally, could I ask you,
Chairman.
just in relation to, you mentioned to Deputy Munster earlier on that that revenue, that you don't have, that there wasn't revenue lost or there wasn't taxation lost, but if you're self-employed, right, the employer's PRSI contribution is different than if you're employing a PAYE worker, and we all know that, right?
Yep.
And have revenue done a calculation in terms of the differential? Because you've had a whole sector now. I know that it's been wound down now, and I see in the papers just played for today that's actually down to 2 firms, and that's welcome. But what I'm asking you here specifically is that you have a whole category of workers, first of all, who weren't getting the correct PRSI contributions, right? And secondly, from the point of view of the state coffers, the fact that the state was not receiving employers' PRSI, has revenue done any calculation in terms of the loss of revenue to the state on that, or put a figure on that?
Sorry, Deputy, this goes back to the basis. The agreement we were looking at is to apply POAE system to self-employed couriers. That's what we were doing. If there's a question about, and it's interesting to look at the figures in relation to the sector and to the economy from 2010 to 2019, there hasn't been any significant change in the level of self-employed numbers in the economy, or S-class PRSI people.
Question, Mr. Cody, with respect, it's a different question I'm asking you. That if these workers...
But with respect, Chairman, you're asking me
just allow me to
put a figure on to accept the argument that the couriers were employees.
No, I'm not asking you to accept an argument. What I'm asking you to give me an answer to is this, and maybe I'm not putting it clearly enough, is that if the workers in that sector were employees as opposed to being grouped together and counted as self-employed in 1997, from then up to the discontinuation of the scheme, obviously, and you know this and I know it, right, that there's a huge differential there in terms of PRSI contributions to the state, okay? What I'm asking you is a yes or no answer. Has revenue done a calculation in terms of the loss to the state over that period of time? For example, if the workers were treated as employees, what would the PRSI gained from that have been? And as opposed to what was the actual PRSI gained because of the classification as self-employed? That's the question. It's a yes or a no. I'm not locking into an argument whichever. I'm asking the question.
Then Deputy, the answer is no.
No, that's fair enough. No, that's fine. Okay, thanks for that. Now, just to bring people in for a second round, and I know one deputy has to be in for leaders' questions, Deputy Murphy, so I'll let Deputy Murphy in first, 3 minutes, and just any other deputy, just put up your hand signal virtually, and I'll get you in that order. So, Deputy Murphy. Maybe she's gone. She's gone. Okay, Deputy Munster, 3 minutes.
Chair, could I just ask, given that the Revenue's refusal to agree to an investigation into the courier deal that was done, could I ask the CNAG who actually investigates revenue, or is he aware of any investigation into revenue in the past? Who conducted it, or who are they answerable to? That's my first one, Chair, please.
Well, Chair, quite simply, I mean, the accounting officer is here today. He's answerable to the committee. But is that the question you're asking? Well,
I mean, they're refusing. We've asked for an investigation and they've refused it. They've said that their determinations remain valid despite everything that has happened. So if they're not acquiescing to our request for an investigation, where do we go from here?
I do wonder, and I'm not familiar with all of the documentation that the chair was quoting, but it seems to me that the kernel of the issue is whether or not certain sectors of economic activity should be treated as, and certain people working in that activity should be treated as self-employed or not. Now, that seems to me to be an issue probably primarily for the Department of Social Protection and perhaps for the Department of Finance. So it's more of a policy question, I think, as to how certain activities are to be treated. And then from revenue's point of view, it seems to me it's about applying the law as it exists rather than as you might like it to be or want it to be. Mm-hmm.
Because you know, it was revenue that determined the four factors that deemed those couriers to be self-employed in the first instance, and that has transpired to be against Irish law, Irish law. So, no, I hear what you're saying, CNAG. Could I just ask the department, when an organisation voluntarily engages with revenue, say to make a settlement with regards to bogus self-employment, would you accept a report commissioned by a third party as the basis for that settlement, or would you be inclined to conduct your own investigation?
We'll have regard to whatever information comes to us. So if there's a report or a submission by, and we would deal with this regularly in compliance across all sets of, we encourage businesses to review.
Sorry, So if there was,
generally it'll be submissions from accountants and lawyers, and we will examine then and we will sample it. We're not dependent on that. We can go in and do our own, but we can also generally in a self-assessment system, what we will do is engage with the taxpayer, and if their advisors come up with a submission, we will quality check that, we will audit it, and we will have assured ourselves.
Just for clarity, so you would accept a report commissioned by a third party, and would you then conduct your own investigation?
I'm not sure, Deputy, what you mean by commissioned by a third party. Well, I don't understand.
Would you accept a report that was, say, furnished by a third party, whether it be a consultant agency or any of the?
If a taxpayer engaged a company, a professional firm to review their affairs, we would take that submission. And that would be fairly normal because most taxpayers have their advisors.
What I wanted to know. And just that investigation would result in the creation of a lot of documents, I'd imagine. Would a final report of sorts be produced, and would that be made available to the persons disclosing a practice of miscalculation upon their request?
I know exactly what you're talking about, Deputy.
Well, you're presuming, but I'm just asking you just.
Oh, okay. Sorry for presuming. What we would do is we would generally in a settlement or an audit, there's considerable exchange of paper over a period of time. The final settlement letter may well be a summary of the issues, but the summary may have arisen prior to that, and it depends on the facts and circumstances. But generally, and the controller
would that be made available then to the person or persons that disclose the practice?
Well, it depends on what the process has been, because the information may well be submitted to us, setting out the details of the computations. And if we were satisfied with them, we wouldn't necessarily set out the computations back to them if it's based on the computations that they sent to us, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah, but even on their request, if they wanted your final analysis or whatever, would it be made available upon their request?
Well, like that kind of, generally, the information that's involved in the settlement is familiar to both sets and is usually really well documented. And I wouldn't be aware of any situation where somebody had to request the basis of the settlement that they've agreed after they've agreed it.
Just finally, Chair,
just
just finally, could you provide an indication to the committee, just an indication? Say if we took someone earning between 40,000 and 50,000, if they were misclassified as self-employed rather than as an employee, how much might the settlement with revenue be? And would that beget a similar settlement with, say, the Department of Social Protection? Can you indicate how much that would be for the same individual, just to get an idea of?
Could I ask Mr. Cody to come back to you and write in that question? Just calculation to do, right? But also, if
you want, Chairman, I can give you just a very simple example.
Just very, very briefly.
If you take somebody that was on 35,000 in 2021, so kind of, so if they were self-employed, they would have a total deduction of 5,978 between tax, USC, PYE USC, and personal PRSI liability. And if they were an employee, they would have a total of 29,022 net income, the same net income and the same contributions by them of 5,978, and an employer PRSI contribution, which is what the chairman was talking to me about. The differential is the employer's PRSI contribution, and that's 3,867.
Okay.
So that would be the difference liability in being a self-employed and an employee at 35,000.
Thank you.
And that's taken it that there are no expenses claims or anything like that. That's just on basic gross income.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Cormac Devlin.
Thank you, Ciarán. And